Everybody, and welcome to another video. And today it is the 20th of January, and today I will be talking about the situation on the Zaporizhzhia front, which is probably the front that I've talked about the least throughout this entire conflict, because since March the situation has really been static over here. Neither side has really taken the initiative and launched any sort of offensive operations up until now, potentially, because now we're receiving a lot of news about some potential Russian advances that I'm going to be talking about today. And again, a lot of this is not confirmed yet because we don't have a lot of footage to back this up. The footage that does exist is very scant, but I'm going to try to piece together the information that we have from both sides to try to give you guys a pretty comprehensive report. So the situation in Zaporizhzhia that I'm talking about today, I think it starts with this town over here that Russia took over in December. I talked about this at the time. And this town over here is called Dorozhenyanka. The Russians, they took it over. This was mentioned by their Ministry of Defense. And this is interesting because really there was no Ukrainian pushback. So it was basically an abandoned town. And this is something that is really the case for many of these towns along the front line of Zaporizhzhia. A lot of these towns are not actually occupied by one side or the other. They don't have fortifications set up over there that are being filled in with either Russian or Ukrainian troops. A lot of them are abandoned. And so the Russians, they probably tried to probe the line over here to see if there would be some sort of Ukrainian resistance. And when they saw there was none, they just entered the town and just took over those positions. And so that was really setting the pattern for 2023, where we've seen over the past 2 weeks a lot of Russian probing operations in this general area. Nothing big up until the past 2 days. But again, there were just probing attacks like we've seen for a while in Shcherbaki, this entire area, Malinivka. And now, as of January 19th, which was yesterday, the Russians had actually begun launching some offensive operations in the direction of this town over here, Lobkove. So Lobkove, I thought it was under Russian control beforehand, and a lot of the pro-Russian maps also had it marked as such. So perhaps it was a gray zone at the time, and that neither side really controlled it. The Ukrainian line is along this road over here, and the Russian along this road. So Lobkove would be in the middle. And then the Russians tried probing the line. There was no resistance, so they took it over. And then using their positions over here, they really gained the initiative for the first time in a while. And they were able to enter the town of Stepove over here, where there is fighting going on the outskirts right now. It's a very small town, so you could expect it to fall pretty soon. Again, it's not that important at the moment because I would say the more important towns are Malinivka and Shcherbaki, these two towns over here, which were previously under Russian control, but Ukraine counterattacked and took them over again. So, using these positions, they were able to cut off the road that linked the Ukrainian grouping that is adjacent to the Dnipro River around Kamyanske to the one in Orikhiv. So, basically, how the Ukrainian defensive line over here operates is that there are several defensive nodes that are just centered around urban clusters. So Orikhiv is a good example of that, or Huliaipole is a good example of that over here. Huliaipole, that's a smaller one, but it's also a pretty good example. And again, all of these are just centered around this one road, which leads from Huliaipole all the way to the Dnipro River. And so now Russia was able to disconnect the unity between a lot of these different defensive nodes, and they did this in a pretty quick fashion, so the Ukrainians didn't have much time to respond, but they did respond to the best of their abilities. We actually have geolocated footage of Ukraine attacking Russian vehicles and infantry. You can see how the Russians were probing the Ukrainian line, hiding in different forest belts, and then just slowly advancing and then running through the open fields. And then you had some also infantry fighting vehicles and tanks and such. So the Ukrainians, they were responding with short-range howitzers and artillery fire, but it was not enough to stop the Russian advance. They were able to take over Malinivka and Shcherbaki, and they were able to secure the flanks of Orikhiv. So now they're applying pressure in this direction. They have control of this key road that could be used to assault Novoandriivka, which is one of the many suburbs of Orikhiv that I'm going to be talking about in a second. And so, again, this just puts Orikhiv in a very bad position because it's being enveloped from several sides. It is in a very precarious situation. I'm going to show that on the elevation map later on. But here you can see that originally the front line looked a lot more like this. So this was the general front line that I had drawn up, where Ukraine actually had some forward positions around the open fields and the local ridges. But the Russians, they were able to, in the past 2 days, advance along this general area. I would say their advance was based around these fields over here, which are located in a higher elevation. And then due to this advance, they probably were able to get, by default, control of a lot of these roads that are on a lower elevation. And it seems like the bulk of the Ukrainian defensive formations over here weren't really centered around these outskirts, so they quickly had to withdraw to their main defensive line. Another reason why this could be the case is because a lot of the Ukrainian forces in this area that had previously prevented a Russian breakthrough have been sent to Bakhmut. There are about 27 brigades that are centered around the entire Bakhmut axis, and a lot of those used to be in Zaporizhzhia. A lot of them were originally from Kherson, and then they got moved to Zaporizhzhia because they wanted to enter Melitopol and conduct this major offensive to cut off the land bridge between Russia proper and Crimea. But that has not come into fruition due to the fact that a lot of those forces have been pinned down in Bakhmut. I'm going to actually give some examples of that. So you have the 102nd and the 110th Territorial Defense Brigades. A lot of maps show those as stationed in Zaporizhzhia, and maybe they still have some units there, but a lot of those brigades, a lot of those battalions within those brigades, they were moved into Bakhmut, and that was just to reinforce the line. And you can see how it's reinforced the line, but at the cost of moving out key units from these defensive nodes. And another example that's even more important is the 58th Motorized Brigade, one of the better Ukrainian units that was moved out of Zaporizhzhia into Bakhmut. So this is part of the reason why the Ukrainian defensive line was weakened over here. So the Russians, they were able to advance in this general direction. They, specifically the unit over here, the 291st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment, they were able to take over positions around this town Novopokrovka and enter Mala Tokmachka. They haven't taken it over completely, but they are now probing the suburbs, and they're also using their positions in Bilohuria to assist them. Then to the south, there's fighting in Novodanilivka, where you have some Ukrainian units such as the 59th Motorized Brigade, the 9th Operational Regiment, which is the Zaporizhzhia branch of the National Guard, operating in this area. And then you also have the 106th Detached Territorial Defense Brigade. So a lot of these territorial defense units are stationed in Zaporizhzhia. The issue is that they're less trained and they're more lightly equipped, so they're not the best fighting force, although they're just used as fill-ins in some of these areas that are more static in nature, which is why they may be less experienced in fighting. So the Russians, they also advance onto Malinivka, as I said before. So you could see what's going on over here. It's being enveloped in this cauldron, and the Russians, they now have, first of all, physical control of this road, and they might be able to get fire control over some of the roads leading into Orikhiv at this point. And because Orikhiv is located on a pretty low elevation, they could also fire on the city itself from some of the high ground that they have taken over very recently, which is really located in between these roads over here. So I'm putting X's in this general area. I'm actually going to move to the topographic map right now. So yeah, this is the general front line. I just drew this off the top of my head right now. And you can see how the Russians, they are taking over positions on a lower elevation, the roads leading into the town itself. And they're also at the same time taking over these higher positions over here that I'm going to circle. These are in red. They're about 100 meters higher than the lower ground in Orikhiv itself. So it's not that substantial, but then again, it is advantageous for the Russians, especially with their new positions captured in Srechebaki and Mala Srechebaki. And so, yeah, the situation in Orikhiv is not looking good. And Orikhiv is one of the main defensive nodes for the Ukrainians. It's a transport hub, supply hub, and it would open up a new offensive opportunity for Russia if they were able to take over the city. It would be able to help in an advance onto the city of Zaporizhzhia itself by advancing along the H08 highway. So now let's go back and talk about some of the other towns over here, because there's still pressure going on, not just in Orikhiv, but also further to the east. So we did hear of some reports of fighting around Mirny, but this was more isolated. The Ukrainian grouping in Huliaipole is holding pretty strong right now. You have the 108th Detached Territorial Defense Brigade in this area. Not much going on over there. But in Huliaipole, there is a bit more activity. I did expect there to be actually more activity in this region because Huliaipole is, again, probably the second most important city in this entire defensive line behind Orikhiv. But to my surprise, we haven't really seen an advance from Marfapil to the outskirts of Huliaipole or from Dorozhnyanka onto the southern outskirts of Huliaipole. It's actually been relatively quiet. It's just been cross-front shelling. Where we have seen most of the activity is in this town over here, Malinivka, where I need to change the map because it's actually closer to this. This is the closer outlook on the situation, where the Russians are pushing, especially from the south, but also you could say from the east, onto the eastern side of Malinivka, and they're taking over the heights just to the south of it and trying to push the Ukrainians out at this point. And the unit that I believe is involved in this, or the army that is involved in this, is the 5th Combined Arms Army. I don't necessarily know which division or which regiment is involved in it for the Russian side, but I just know in general that it was the 5th Combined Arms Army that is taking part in these operations. Taking Malinivka helps get control of some of the flanks to Huliaipole. It could be a stepping stone to advancing along this road over here and then getting advantageous positions to fire onto Huliaipole and sort of create a situation that's similar to Orikhiv, where it's being enveloped from all sides. So again, it's just also spreading out Ukrainian forces in this area that are already lacking in manpower, especially in trained manpower, spreading them even more thinly, as there were several different key attacks on different parts of the front line. Now that's really it in terms of the different advances on the front line. I did also hear of some fighting going on and just shelling around Velika, Novosilka, but I think that the Ukrainians are very dug in over here after months of fighting, so I don't expect a major Russian advance in this area just yet. You have the 128th Dnipro City Defense Brigade stationed over here to hold the line, and they've been doing a pretty good job at that. So the army that is really responsible for these attacks is the 58th Combined Arms Army. This is the one that's really engaging in the battles in Orikhiv. And then in terms of some of the subdivisions within this army, you have the 19th Motor Rifle Division, which is stationed further to the west around Kamyanske. You have around Sturchubaki, the 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division. You have just south of Orikhiv, the 205th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. And then, as I said before, near Mala Tokmachka, you have the 291st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment. And so a lot of these gains, they can't be backed up by video footage. The only video footage that I've seen is very vague, very ambiguous, because it's only in open fields and it shows either shelling or Russian air activity, which also shows that the Russian Air Force is aiding in this offensive operation, you could say. So looking into the future, what we could see is that Russia's probably going to try to envelop many of these key defensive nodes in cauldrons like Orikhiv, Huliaipolsky, and Huliaipole, if they actually go forward with these attacks. Another theory is that perhaps they won't go forward with these attacks, and that it's just pinning down even more of these Ukrainian troops that would in theory have been sent to Bakhmut, just spreading them out even more thinly, because I do feel like maybe like some of these territorial defense units may have been sent to Bakhmut, given the fact that the situation is deteriorating over there. So all in all, that's the situation in Zaporizhzhia. I will update it if anything changes. So thank you guys for watching.